Picture this. It is the middle of a Southern Hemisphere winter, July 1930, and you are standing in a city called Montevideo on the eastern bank of a wide, silver river where it flows into the Atlantic Ocean. The air is cool and salt-tinged. The streets of Uruguay's capital are buzzing with something that feels electric and new and slightly nervous all at once. The way things feel when something important is about to happen for the very first time, and nobody quite knows how it is going to go. Down at the waterfront, ships have been docking for weeks. Not cargo ships, passenger ships. And the passengers stepping off them are not merchants or immigrants. They are football players. Young men with leather boots and canvas kit bags, arriving from Argentina and Brazil and Chile and Bolivia and Paraguay, from France and Belgium and Yugoslavia and Romania. 13 nations in total, representing every corner of a world that is still recovering from one catastrophic war and sliding, though nobody knows it yet, toward another. They have come to play football. They have come to compete for something that has never before existed. They have come to the first FIFA World Cup. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And please, tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. I love knowing that this story is traveling across time zones, across hemispheres, into rooms and headphones and late-night kitchens all over the planet. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the World Cup is, at its heart, the story of football itself, which is to say, it is the story of the whole world in miniature. Every 4 years, this tournament gathers the nations of the earth together on a football pitch, and whatever happens between them reflects something real about what is happening everywhere else. The politics, the economics, the ambitions, the fears, the moments of breathtaking beauty, and the moments of breathtaking dishonesty. The World Cup has been held through the shadows of war and through the glittering excess of the modern entertainment era. It has been stolen, recovered by a dog, and stolen again. It has produced the greatest goals ever scored in any sport and the most blatant acts of cheating ever celebrated in public. It has made gods out of ordinary young men from ordinary places, and it has broken hearts on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Tonight, we are going to travel the whole thing, every era, every unforgettable moment, every tournament from that first cool winter afternoon in Montevideo in 1930 to the extraordinary expanding spectacle of 2026. Settle in. This is a long and beautiful story. The man whose vision created the World Cup was a French lawyer named Jules Rimet. Rimet had become president of FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, in 1921, and from early in his presidency, he had a dream that consumed him. A world championship of football, open to all nations, independent of the Olympic Games, the definitive test of who could play the beautiful game best. The Olympic football tournament, which had been the most prestigious international competition, had its limitations, particularly its strict rules about amateurism, which excluded professional players and therefore excluded the best players in the world from competing. Rimet wanted a tournament without those restrictions. He wanted the best players, the best teams, the most complete test possible. On May 28, 1928, at the 17th FIFA Congress in Amsterdam, Rimet formally proposed staging a world championship. The vote was in favor. The tournament would be held in 1930. The question of where produced an answer that astonished the European football associations that made up most of FIFA's membership: Uruguay. Uruguay was chosen for two reasons. First, it was the reigning Olympic football champion, having won gold at both the 1924 Paris Games and the 1928 Amsterdam Games. Second, and this was the practical argument that sealed the deal, Uruguay offered to pay all the travel and accommodation expenses for every participating team. In 1930, that was a genuinely extraordinary financial commitment, and it was necessary because the alternative, asking European clubs to release their players for months at their own expense, was not going to produce the participation FIFA needed. Even with Uruguay covering the costs, getting European teams to make the journey was an enormous challenge. The Great Depression had gripped most of the Western world. players worried that their jobs would not be waiting when they returned from a 2-month journey to South America. The deadline for entries passed in February 1930, with not a single European nation having accepted. Jules Rimet, determined that his tournament would not be a purely South American affair, personally intervened. He persuaded France, his home country, and Yugoslavia to participate. Belgium and Romania were also eventually convinced, with the Romanian king. King Carol II, who had a taste for the dramatic, personally selecting his country's squad, giving the players a 3-month leave of absence from their jobs, and guaranteeing their employment on return. So 13 nations arrived in Montevideo, 7 from South America, 4 from Europe, 2 from North America. And they played football in what Jules Rimet called, with understandable pride, the temple of football. The Estadio Centenario, a 90,000-seat stadium built specifically for the tournament to celebrate the centenary of Uruguayan independence. The very first match in World Cup history was played on July 13th, 1930, between France and Mexico. France won 4-1. And the very first goal in World Cup history was scored by a Frenchman named Lucien Laurent, a right winger who struck a volley into the net in the 19th minute. Laurent was 23 years old. He would later say, with endearing modesty, that he had no idea at the time how significant the moment was. He was just doing his job. Historians still argue whether the first World Cup would have been a commercial and sporting success if Uruguay had not won it. The crowds for matches not involving the host nation were sometimes embarrassingly small, and the tournament's organization was loose by modern standards. But Uruguay did win it, defeating Argentina 4-2 in the final in front of 68,346 people, and the atmosphere was extraordinary. Uruguay had beaten their great South American rival on home soil to become the first world champions in football history. July 31st was declared a national holiday in Uruguay. The president of the Uruguayan Football Association received the trophy, a golden statuette representing the Greek goddess of victory, from Jules Rimet's own hands. And the World Cup, which had begun as one French lawyer's passionate dream, was suddenly very real and very important. The success of the first World Cup in Uruguay created an immediate problem, that is, when you think about it, a very nice kind of problem to have. So many nations wanted to participate in the next tournament that for the first time in the competition's brief history, qualification matches had to be held. The World Cup had gone from an invitational tournament that struggled to fill 13 spots to a competition with a waiting list. In the space of 4 years, Jules Rimet's dream had become something the entire football world wanted to be part of. The 1934 World Cup was held in Italy, and it introduced the world to a pattern that would repeat itself with uncomfortable regularity throughout the tournament's history, the host nation winning on home soil. Italy, under their coach Vittorio Pozzo, a compact, intense man who had an almost military approach to preparation and discipline, won the tournament on their home ground, defeating Czechoslovakia 2-1 in the final in Rome after extra time. It was the first World Cup played in Europe, the first to require qualification, and the first to feature 16 teams. There was, however, a significant and rather embarrassing development. Uruguay, the reigning champions who had hosted the first tournament and whose flag bore the first World Cup title, refused to participate. They were furious that so few European nations had bothered to travel to Montevideo in 1930, and they had absolutely no interest in returning the favor. It was a reminder, early in the tournament's history, that football politics and national pride were going to be permanent features of the World Cup landscape. In Uruguay's view, the Europeans had disrespected them. They were not going to forget it. Italy made it 2 in a row at the 1938 World Cup in France, once again coached by Pozzo, once again winning in the final, this time defeating Hungary 4-2. Italy remains the only nation to have successfully defended a World Cup title in consecutive tournaments, a record that stands to this day, and that speaks to the remarkable consistency Pozzo built into his squads. He was a man who studied his opponents in extraordinary detail, who paid close attention to the physical conditioning of his players at a time when most coaches relied primarily on technical instruction, and who had an uncanny ability to get the maximum performance from his teams in the highest pressure situations. One genuinely strange detail from the 1938 tournament. The Dutch East Indies appeared at the World Cup, making them the first Asian nation to ever do so, and lost to Hungary 6-0 in the first round. The Dutch East Indies would later become Indonesia, which means that Indonesia holds the distinction of being the first Asian nation in World Cup history, a fact that surprises most people who hear it for the first time. The 1938 tournament had a shadow hanging over it that the football world could not entirely ignore. Europe was in serious political crisis. Adolf Hitler's Germany had recently annexed Austria, and the Austrian team, which had been one of the best in Europe, was absorbed into the German squad for the tournament. Several matches were played in a climate of tension that had little to do with football, and when Italy won the title, their players gave the fascist salute on the podium. It was an uncomfortable moment that illustrated how thoroughly the political realities of the era had inserted themselves into the tournament. And then the world went to war. The 1942 and 1946 World Cups were canceled. 6 years of global conflict consumed the lives of tens of millions of people, destroyed cities, and reshaped the political map of the entire planet. Football, in the context of what was happening to humanity in those years, was irrelevant, and yet the sport survived. It was played in prisoner of war camps. It was played on makeshift pitches in bombed-out cities. It was played wherever people needed a few moments of normalcy and shared purpose amid the catastrophe. When the World Cup returned in 1950, the world it returned to was a different place. Europe was rebuilding. A new set of political tensions between the Western democracies and the Soviet bloc was dividing the globe. Germany and Japan, the defeated powers, were not invited to the tournament. England, remarkably, was appearing at the World Cup for the very first time. English football had long regarded itself as the originator and natural master of the game, and English football officials had been somewhat dismissive of FIFA's tournaments in the 1930s, declining to participate. Now, finally, England showed up in Brazil. The 1950 World Cup was held in Brazil, and it produced a moment so shocking, so emotionally devastating to the Brazilian nation, and so perfectly constructed as sporting drama that it remains, more than 7 decades later, the single most discussed and emotionally freighted match in the tournament's history. But before we get to that extraordinary afternoon in Rio de Janeiro, let us note what the 1950 World Cup gave to football history on its way to that climax. The tournament used a unique format, a final round-robin group of 4 teams rather than a single knockout final. That has never been repeated. Brazil had constructed the Maracanã Stadium in Rio, one of the largest sporting venues ever built, with an official capacity of over 170,000 and an actual attendance at the decisive final match that some estimates put even higher. It was a building on a scale that defied imagination, a cathedral of football built to celebrate Brazil's certainty that they were about to win the World Championship in front of their own people. And then came the United States and England, and the first great upset. England, playing their first World Cup, were considered one of the heavy favorites for the tournament. They had never participated before, but English football's reputation as the mother of the game and the standard bearer of technical quality made most observers assume the English would be a formidable force. Their group match against the United States on June 29, 1950, in the city of Belo Horizonte was supposed to be a straightforward English victory. The Americans had lost 7 consecutive international matches before the tournament by a combined score of 45 goals to 2. The English had Stanley Matthews, Tom Finney, and a squad of genuine quality. In the 37th minute, a Haitian-born American player named Joe Gaetjens headed the ball into the English net. It deflected slightly as it went in, and England goalkeeper Bert Williams had no chance. The United States held on for the rest of the match. Final score: United States 1, England 0. Back in England, newspaper editors refused to print the result because they assumed the score had been transmitted incorrectly. They thought somebody had dropped a digit. The result that arrived read 1-0 to the United States. Editors assumed it must have been 10-0 to England and printed it accordingly. England were knocked out in the group stage. The United States. Amateurs and semi-professionals who worked as dishwashers, postal workers, and factory hands had beaten the self-declared masters of football. Historians still argue whether this remains the greatest upset in World Cup history, with some pointing to later shocks as even more improbable. But in terms of the gap between expectation and result, and in terms of the sheer refusal of the result to be believed by those who heard it, nothing quite matches that afternoon in Belo Horizonte. The 1950 World Cup was building towards something. Through the group stages and into the final round robin, Brazil moved with the unstoppable momentum of a team that seemed to have been assembled specifically to win this particular tournament at this particular moment in history. They beat Sweden 7-1. They beat Spain 6-1. Their football was beautiful and ruthless simultaneously. Flowing, creative, technically brilliant, and utterly devastating in front of goal. Going into the final decisive match of the round robin, Brazil needed only a draw to become world champions. Uruguay needed a win. The mathematics were overwhelmingly in Brazil's favor. The Maracana was filled to a number that the official records list as 173,850. Though many historians believe the actual crowd exceeded 200,000, making it the largest attendance ever recorded for a football match anywhere in the world before or since. Brazilian newspapers had already printed headlines declaring Brazil the champions. The federation had prepared gold watches, inscribed with congratulatory messages, ready to be handed to the Brazilian players after their inevitable triumph. Songs had been written. Celebrations had been planned. One Brazilian newspaper ran the headline, "Here are the world champions," the morning before the match was played. The Uruguayan captain, Obdulio Varela, a powerful and commanding midfielder known as the Black Chief, saw Brazilian newspapers proclaiming his opponent's victory before a ball had been kicked. According to accounts of the day, he gathered the newspapers, soaked them in water in the team's dressing room toilet, and told his players, "Nothing printed here matters, only what happens on that pitch." Brazil scored first, through a player named Friacha, in the 47th minute. The enormous crowd erupted. The celebration had begun. Brazil were leading. One draw was all they needed. And then Uruguay scored. Juan Alberto Schiaffino, one of the finest players of his generation, equalized in the 66th minute. The crowd fell silent in a way that felt, by all contemporary accounts, deeply unnatural, as if 200,000 people had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. The noise of that stadium going quiet is described in accounts from the day as one of the most chilling sounds any of the journalists present had ever experienced. 11 minutes from the end, Alcides Gigia, a 23-year-old Uruguayan winger, surged down the right flank with the ball. Brazilian goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa moved to cover what he expected to be a cross. Gigia instead shot, low and hard, into the near post. The ball went in. Uruguay 2, Brazil 1. The silence that followed was total. It lasted for what witnesses described as a full minute. 200,000 people in absolute, disbelieving silence in the largest stadium in the world. Then the crying began. Brazilian players collapsed on the pitch. People in the stands wept openly. The Brazilian authorities who had prepared the victory celebrations quietly disappeared. The gold watches inscribed with congratulatory messages were never distributed. This match became known forever as the Maracanazo, a word combining the name of the stadium with a Spanish suffix meaning a blow or a strike, capturing the idea of a shattering impact. Pelé, who was 9 years old at the time and watching the match from his home in the city of Bauru with his father, later said it was the first time he ever saw his father cry. He vowed that day to win the World Cup for Brazil. The Maracanazo was more than a sporting defeat. Brazilian football psychologists and sociologists have written about it for decades as a genuine national trauma, an event that reshaped Brazilian football identity. Brazil changed their white kit after 1950, adopting the now iconic yellow and green jersey in 1954, partly to distance themselves from the colors associated with that devastating day. Moacir Barbosa, the goalkeeper who had moved the wrong way for Gigia's winning shot, was blamed by Brazilian society in a way that followed him for the rest of his life. He died in 2000, reportedly having said that in Brazil, the maximum sentence for any crime was 30 years, but he had been sentenced for life. Alcides Gigia, the man who scored the winning goal, later said with quiet satisfaction, "Only 3 people have ever silenced the Maracanã. Frank Sinatra, Pope John, Paul II, and me. He was not wrong." The 1954 World Cup moved to Switzerland, and it produced one of the most remarkable stories of the tournament's early decades, the miracle of Bern. West Germany, playing in their first World Cup since the end of World War II, won the tournament in circumstances that seemed genuinely improbable. In the group stage, Hungary had beaten them 8-3, one of the heaviest group stage defeats in World Cup history. Hungary in 1954 were perhaps the greatest international football team ever assembled to that point. They were known as the Magnificent Magyars, and they had not lost a single international match in 4 years. Their squad included players of extraordinary quality: Ferenc Puskás, Sándor Kocsis, Zoltán Dzsibor, and they played a fluid, technically advanced form of football that was years ahead of most of their opponents. In the final, West Germany met Hungary again. Hungary scored first, then scored again. West Germany, 2-0 down, fought back to level. And then, with 6 minutes remaining, a West German player named Helmut Rahn scored what would be the winning goal. West Germany won 3-2. The result was so shocking that a Hungarian radio commentator, broadcasting live, reportedly went silent for a long moment after the German third goal, unable to process what he was seeing. Hungarian fans in the stands wept. The team that was widely considered the best in the world had lost the World Cup final to a team that they had beaten by 5 goals in the group stage. Historians still argue whether the 1954 Hungarian team was the greatest football team never to win the World Cup, a debate that resurfaces every time a dominant pre-tournament favorite fails to take the trophy. The Magnificent Magyars dissolved not long after. Political circumstances in Hungary following the 1956 uprising caused several players to defect to Western Europe, ending the team's extraordinary run. The West German victory, known in Germany as the Miracle of Bern, was more than a sporting achievement. West Germany in 1954 was a country still emerging from the rubble and shame of the Nazi era, still divided, still rebuilding, still finding its place in the world. The World Cup victory provided something that went beyond sport, a moment of collective pride and national identity for a country that had very little to be proud of just 9 years earlier. The German journalist who coined the phrase "Miracle of Bern" was not exaggerating the emotional weight the victory carried. And then came 1958, and a 17-year-old boy from a small city in the Brazilian interior who would spend the next decade redefining what was possible in football. His name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento. Everyone called him Pelé. Brazil had been chasing the World Cup since 1950, with an intensity shaped by the Maracanazo's devastating memory. They had won the right to host the tournament in 1950 and still lost. They had been knocked out in the quarterfinals in 1954. Now, in Sweden in 1958, they arrived with a team built around new ideas about attacking football and a 17-year-old who had been described by those who watched him train as the most naturally gifted player they had ever seen. Pelé played his first World Cup match against the Soviet Union and scored against Wales in the quarterfinal, becoming, at 17 years and 239 days old, the youngest scorer in World Cup history, a record that still stands today. In the final against Sweden, he scored twice. Brazil won 5-2. Their first World Cup was won in spectacular, joyful, uninhibited fashion, and the football world saw for the first time the style that would come to be called Jogo Bonito, the beautiful game, expressed at its most pure. A fun and slightly absurd detail about the 1958 tournament. Brazil's team psychologist recommended before the tournament that Pelé should be left out of the squad on the grounds that a psychological evaluation showed he lacked the fighting spirit necessary for international competition. The players refused to accept this recommendation, and the 17-year-old who supposedly lacked fighting spirit went on to become arguably the greatest footballer the tournament has ever seen. The psychologist was presumably not invited back. Brazil in 1958 had shown the world something new. They had shown that football could be played with a kind of freedom and creativity and physical intelligence that made the older, more rigid European approaches look like they were playing a different sport entirely. Their triumph in Sweden had the quality of a revelation, not just a victory, but a demonstration that the game itself had more possibilities in it than most people had imagined. 4 years later in Chile in 1962, Brazil were back to defend their title. Pelé was injured early in the tournament. In just the second group match against Czechoslovakia, a muscle strain ended his participation, and Brazil had to find a way forward without their young superstar. What they found was Garrincha. Manuel Francisco dos Santos, known as Garrincha, a Portuguese word meaning little bird, was one of the most extraordinary footballers who ever lived, and his story is one of the most remarkable in the tournament's history. He was born with a spine that curved to one side and two legs that both curved in the same direction, so that he appeared to walk with a pronounced wobble. Doctors who examined him as a child suggested he would struggle to walk normally, let alone play professional football. He became one of the greatest dribblers in the history of the game. Garrincha dominated the 1962 World Cup. He was named the player of the tournament. He scored twice in the quarterfinal against England and twice in the semifinal against Chile. Brazil won the tournament without Pelé, which is perhaps the most extraordinary testament to the depth of quality in that squad. They defeated Czechoslovakia 3-1 in the final. Brazil had won back-to-back World Cups, becoming the second team after Italy to successfully defend the title. The 1962 tournament also introduced the wider football world to a shift in tactics that would shape the game for decades. Several teams arrived in Chile playing with defensive formations that prioritized solidity over attacking invention, a trend that would intensify through the 1960s and 1970s, as coaches increasingly concluded that not losing was a more reliable strategy than trying to win. This was a source of ongoing frustration for football purists who felt the game's beauty was being sacrificed for results. The tension between defensive pragmatism and attacking ambition has never been fully resolved in football, and the World Cup has been the stage where that tension plays out most publicly every 4 years. Now, the 1966 World Cup arrived in England. And before we even get to what happened on the pitch, we need to talk about what happened off it, because the 1966 tournament produced one of the most bizarre and entertaining stories in the entire history of international sport. The Jules Rimet trophy was stolen. 4 months before the tournament began, in March 1966, the Golden Trophy, which had been put on display at a stamp exhibition, of all things, at Westminster Central Hall in London, was taken from its display cabinet by a thief who somehow slipped past multiple security guards in broad daylight. The trophy was gone. Scotland Yard launched a full investigation. A ransom note arrived, signed by a man calling himself Jackson, demanding £15,000 and including a piece of the trophy's lining as proof. Police set up a sting operation with fake cash. They caught a small-time criminal named Edward Betchley, who claimed to be only a middleman. The trophy was still missing. A week after the theft, a man named David Corbett took his dog for an evening walk near his home in South London. The dog, a black and white collie named Pickles, began sniffing urgently around a bush. Corbett went to investigate and found a package wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. He tore it open and saw, engraved on a base, the names of previous winning nations. Then he saw a golden figure holding a shallow dish above its head. Pickles had found the World Cup. Corbett rushed to the local police station with his discovery. The officer on duty looked at the trophy skeptically and reportedly said, "Doesn't look very World Cup-y to me, son." It was, of course, very World Cup-y indeed. The trophy was returned, and Pickles became an overnight celebrity, appearing on television, attending a fancy dinner in his honor, and earning his owner a reward. The collie who saved the World Cup lived out his days as a national hero, though he died in 1967 after choking on his lead. Nobody ever conclusively identified the original thief. England won the 1966 tournament on home soil. Their victory in the final against West Germany at Wembley Stadium remains the defining moment of English football history, discussed and dissected and celebrated and argued over more than any other result in the country's sporting past. The final ended 2-2 after 90 minutes, went to extra time, and produced the most debated goal in World Cup history. Geoff Hurst shot in extra time that struck the underside of the crossbar, bounced down, and was given as a goal by the referee on the advice of his Soviet linesman. West Germany insisted to this day, with considerable justification based on subsequent analysis, that the ball did not fully cross the line. England insisted otherwise, with equal conviction and considerably more joy. Geoff Hurst then added a third goal in the final minutes, running onto a long ball, with most of the crowd already on the pitch, thinking the game was over, and striking a left-footed shot into the roof of the net. BBC commentator Kenneth Wolstenholme's words at that moment have been replayed so many times that most English people know them by heart. Some people are on the pitch. They think it's all over. A brief pause. The ball hits the net. It is now. England won 4-2. Bobby Moore lifted the Jules Rimet trophy, the same trophy that had been sitting under a hedge in South London 4 months earlier, sniffed out by a dog called Pickles. The trophy that Moore held up at Wembley on that July afternoon was, as it happens, not entirely the original. A replica had been secretly made during the period. The original was missing, in case it was never recovered, and the two versions were briefly mixed up in the aftermath. But Moore was holding the real thing. He had won England's only World Cup title. The country celebrated with an intensity that has never quite been matched since. Historians still argue whether England deserved their 1966 victory, with critics pointing to the fact that they did not face any of the major South American nations until the final, and with ongoing debate about Hurst's controversial second goal. English football supporters are not generally interested in this argument. The Jules Rimet trophy had a sad ending. Brazil won the World Cup in 1970, their third title, which under the rules of the time meant they kept the trophy permanently. The original gold statuette that Jules Rimet had commissioned in 1930 went to Brazil. In 1983, it was stolen from the Brazilian Football Confederation's offices in Rio de Janeiro. This time, there was no Pickles. The thieves, when they were eventually caught, admitted they had melted the trophy down for its gold content. The most famous trophy in football history no longer exists in physical form. A replica stands in its place in various displays. The original Jules Rimet trophy, the cup that Lucien Laurent's first ever World Cup goal was played toward, that Jules Rimet personally handed to Uruguay's president in 1930, that Bobby Moore lifted at Wembley while Pickles the dog enjoyed his retirement, is gone forever. A new trophy was commissioned for the 1974 World Cup onward. The current FIFA World Cup trophy, designed by Italian sculptor Silvio Gazzaniga, depicts two human figures holding the earth above their heads. It stands 36 centimeters tall and is made of 18-karat gold. Its production cost is estimated at around $240,700. Unlike the Jules Rimet trophy, the new trophy is not given to the winning nation to keep. A replacement was made after the Jules Rimet theft, and FIFA decided that the actual trophy would remain in FIFA's possession permanently. Winning nations receive a gold-plated replica. Only the Jules Rimet trophy was ever truly given away, and it no longer exists. The 1966 England team would be the last home nation to win the World Cup for the foreseeable future. The tournament was about to enter a new era, one defined by Brazil's extraordinary 1970 vintage, by the political upheavals that surrounded multiple tournaments, and by the arrival of new voices and new styles from every corner of the football world. The game was growing. The world was watching. And in Mexico in 1970, something was about to happen that most football historians agree was the single greatest team performance the World Cup has ever seen. Mexico in 1970 was hot, deliberately, controversially, uncomfortably hot. FIFA had scheduled matches at noon in the blazing Mexican sun to accommodate European television broadcast schedules, meaning players were competing at temperatures that modern sports scientists would consider genuinely dangerous. Several nations protested. The scheduling remained. And in that heat, One team played football so beautiful, so technically perfect, so athletically and creatively extraordinary that it has been discussed and argued over and celebrated for more than 50 years as the gold standard of what the game can be at its absolute highest level. Brazil in 1970 had Pelé at 30 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers. They had Rivellino, a left-footed midfielder of devastating precision and imagination. They had Jairzinho, a right winger who scored in every single match of the tournament. The only player in World Cup history to achieve that feat. They had Tostão, Gerson, Clodoaldo. And they had a philosophy of football that was the opposite of the defensive pragmatism that had been spreading through the game. Brazil in 1970 believed in scoring goals. They believed that attacking football was not just more entertaining, but more effective, that the best defense was having the ball and using it to create chances at the other end. They believed, in short, that football should be played the way children play it in the street, with joy and improvisation and technical bravado. Their final against Italy on June 21st, 1970, at the Azteca Stadium in Mexico City, produced the most celebrated team goal in the tournament's history. Brazil were already leading 3-1 when they scored the fourth. The move began in their own half, with Clodoaldo receiving the ball deep in defense and then doing something extraordinary. He dribbled past 4 Italian players in a row in his own penalty area, with the composure of someone taking a gentle warm-up run. The ball moved to Rivellino, then to Jairzinho, then to Pelé, who had the simple option of shooting, but instead pulled the ball square without looking, knowing from instinct alone exactly where his captain would be arriving at pace. Carlos Alberto Torres, the right back, had been running from his own half to meet this moment. He hit the ball first time with his right foot. It flew into the bottom corner. The Azteca erupted. That goal is still regularly voted the greatest team goal ever scored. It was not just technically perfect. It expressed something about that Brazilian team's entire philosophy. Everybody in the right place, everybody trusting everybody else, the move flowing from defense to attack in one unbroken sequence of shared intelligence and shared joy. Brazil won 4-1 and lifted the World Cup for the 3rd time, keeping the Jules Rimet trophy permanently. Pelé had his 3 World Cup winners' medals, 1958, 1962, and 1970. He remains the only player in history to win the tournament 3 times. He was voted the player of the tournament in 1970, his performance widely considered the finest individual display the competition had ever seen. You probably won't survive the rest of tonight's journey without at least one moment of lying awake afterward, wishing you could have seen that Brazilian team play in person. The people who were there in the Azteca in June 1970 spent the rest of their lives knowing they had seen something that would never be repeated. The 1974 World Cup moved to West Germany, and it introduced the football world to a concept that became one of the most discussed tactical ideas in the sport's history. The Dutch national team, guided by the ideas of their brilliant coach Rinus Michels and built around the extraordinary talent of Johan Cruyff, arrived in West Germany playing something called total football. The idea was breathtaking in its simplicity and maddening in its execution. Every player on the team should be able to play in any position, constantly rotating and pressing and creating numerical advantages wherever the ball went. When a defender moved forward, a midfielder dropped back. When a forward came deep, a midfielder pushed forward. The team moved as a single fluid organism, constantly reshaping itself. Cruyff was the human embodiment of this philosophy. He was not the most physically imposing player on the pitch. He was not the fastest or the strongest. But he saw the game 3 moves ahead of everyone else, and he moved with an economy and intelligence that made other very good players look confused and slightly slow. He invented a dribbling move, a feint that involved dragging the ball backward and turning in one motion, that became so associated with him that it is still called the Cruyff turn today, taught in football academies everywhere. The Netherlands played breathtaking football throughout the 1974 tournament. They destroyed Argentina 4-0. They beat Brazil, the reigning champions, 2-0. They reached the final against hosts West Germany and scored before a German player had touched the ball. Johan Neeskens converting a penalty in the opening seconds after a Dutch move that carved through the German defense as if it did not exist. And then they lost. West Germany fought back, scored twice, and won 2-1. The Netherlands, playing arguably the most attractive football of any team at any World Cup since Brazil in 1970, went home without the trophy. They would reach the final again 4 years later in Argentina in 1978 and lose again, this time to the host nation. The Dutch became the greatest team never to win the World Cup, a distinction they hold with a mixture of pride and pain. The 1978 tournament in Argentina carried an uncomfortable political shadow. The country was being governed by a military junta that had seized power in 1976 and was responsible for the disappearance, torture, and murder of thousands of its own citizens. Several nations and many individuals argued that the World Cup should not be held in Argentina. The tournament went ahead. Argentina won it, defeating the Netherlands in the final 3-1 after extra time, with Mario Kempes scoring twice. The images of the junta's leaders celebrating the victory with the national team were broadcast around the world, and the question of whether hosting a World Cup could serve as political legitimacy for a repressive government was raised loudly and has never entirely gone away. The 1982 World Cup in Spain expanded to 24 teams and produced two of the most memorable results in tournament history. The first was West Germany's match against Algeria, a team from Africa making their World Cup debut. Algeria, complete underdogs, defeated West Germany 2-1 in one of the great upsets of the tournament's history. Then, in the second round, West Germany and Austria played a match that both teams needed a German victory by exactly one goal to eliminate Algeria on goal difference. West Germany scored early, and then both teams essentially stopped trying, playing out time in what became known as the Disgrace of Gijón, named after the Spanish city where the match was held. FIFA subsequently changed the rules so that the final matches in a group would always be played simultaneously, preventing precisely this kind of arranged result. The second great story of 1982 was Italy. Italy arrived at the tournament with a striker named Paolo Rossi, who had just completed a 2-year ban from football after being involved in a match-fixing scandal. Rossi played the first 2 rounds, looking rusty and slightly lost. Italy scraped through their group on goals scored after 3 draws. And then Rossi suddenly, explosively, found his form. He scored a hat trick against Brazil in one of the most dramatic matches in World Cup history, eliminating a Brazilian team that many considered favorites. He scored twice in the semifinal against Poland. He scored in the final against West Germany. Italy won 3-1. Paolo Rossi won the Golden Boot as top scorer and the Golden Ball as player of the tournament. It remains one of the most remarkable individual turnarounds in the competition's history. Historians still argue whether the 1982 Brazilian team, which included Zico, Socrates, Falcao, and Junior, and which played some of the most entertaining football of any team at any tournament in the era, was the best team not to win the World Cup, a debate that puts them in direct competition with the Dutch teams of 1974 and 1978 for that particular melancholy honor. The 1986 World Cup in Mexico. The tournament was moved from Colombia, which had originally been awarded hosting rights but withdrew citing financial difficulties. Belongs to one man so completely and so undeniably that to describe it as anything other than his personal tournament would be a disservice to the historical record. Diego Armando Maradona was 5 feet 5 inches tall, built low to the ground with a remarkable center of gravity, and possessed of a left foot that could do things with a football that most people had never seen done before and have not quite seen done since. He was 25 years old in 1986 and at the absolute peak of his extraordinary, complicated, contradictory, magnificent career. Argentina's squad in 1986 was good, but not great by the standards of what a World Cup winning team usually looks like. Their goalkeeper was competent. Their defense was solid. Their midfield was workmanlike. And then there was Maradona. And Maradona was not a player in the ordinary sense. He was a force of nature wearing a blue and white shirt. And in Mexico, in June 1986, he played football at a level that observers struggled to find adequate language for. He had 5 goals and 5 assists across the tournament. He was involved in most of the meaningful attacking moments his team produced. He was fouled repeatedly and ferociously. Opponents who could not get near his football tried to get near him instead. And he got up from those fouls and kept playing. But the match that defined the tournament and defined Maradona's legacy forever was the quarterfinal against England, played on June 22nd at the Azteca Stadium in Mexico City. The political context mattered. Argentina and England had fought a brief but deadly war over the Falkland Islands just 4 years earlier in 1982. 55 British soldiers and 649 Argentine soldiers had died. The match was played in that shadow, and both sets of players and supporters knew it. This was not just a football match. It was a continuation of something. In the 51st minute, Maradona scored a goal that the referee should not have allowed, and that changed the match. A high ball into the England penalty area was challenged by Maradona and England goalkeeper Peter Shilton. Shilton is 6 feet 1 inch tall. Maradona is 5 feet 5. There was no realistic possibility of Maradona winning an aerial challenge against the England goalkeeper. What he did instead, with the speed and deception of a man who had clearly thought about this possibility in advance, was punch the ball into the net with his left hand while making the punch look, to the naked eye of the referee and linesman on the far side of the pitch, like a header. The goal was given. England protested. Maradona celebrated. Afterward, asked about the goal in a press conference, he gave the most perfectly unrepentant answer in the history of sporting press conferences. The goal, he said, had been scored a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. The hand of God. The phrase became immortal. It captured something about Maradona that was both infuriating and irresistible. The sense that he operated by his own rules, that he had a relationship with the laws of the game that was more negotiation than compliance, that he was capable of the most breathtaking dishonesty and the most breathtaking brilliance often within the same few minutes. Because 4 minutes after the hand of God goal, Maradona scored again. And this goal was the opposite of the first. It was not a cheat, but a masterpiece, not a fraud, but a work of pure football art that had no business existing in the same match as the one that preceded it. He received the ball just inside his own half, facing his own goal, surrounded by English players. What followed over the next 11 seconds has been replayed so many times that the images are burned into the collective memory of everyone who has ever loved football. Maradona turned, drove forward, accelerated past one English player, cut inside past another, changed direction to beat a third, moved through the line of the last two defenders, entered the penalty area, dragged the ball past Shilton, the same goalkeeper he had cheated 4 minutes earlier, and placed it into the net. He had dribbled 60 yards. He had beaten 5 English outfield players and the goalkeeper. He had done it at full pace, under pressure, with the consistency of control that comes from 10,000 hours of practice multiplied by a natural talent that cannot be taught or explained. FIFA held a poll in 2002 to vote for the greatest goal in World Cup history. The vote was not particularly close. England's Gary Lineker, who had tremendous respect for Maradona despite everything, later said, "He cheated us, but I've forgiven him. Maradona was the greatest player of our era. The things he did on the pitch were magical." Peter Shilton, the goalkeeper who had been beaten twice in 4 minutes by the same man using completely different methods, has been less forgiving. He has maintained for decades that Maradona cheated, and he is not wrong. But Maradona also created the goal of the century 4 minutes later, and that is also true. And both things live together in the history of that quarterfinal in an uncomfortable and fascinating tension. Argentina went on to beat Belgium in the semifinal. Maradona scored twice, both goals of individual brilliance. The final against West Germany saw Argentina win 3-2, with Jorge Baruchaga scoring the winner in the dying minutes from a Maradona assist. Argentina were world champions for the second time. Maradona had played what is still widely considered the greatest individual tournament performance in World Cup history. The 1990 World Cup moved to Italy, and it opened with one of the greatest upsets in the tournament's history. Cameroon, playing in only their second World Cup, a team of relative unknowns coached by a Soviet manager named Valery Nepomniachtchi, faced defending champions Argentina in the opening match at the San Siro in Milan. Argentina had Maradona. They were expected to win comfortably. Cameroon, reduced to 9 men after 2 red cards in the second half, won 1-0 through a header by Francois Omambiek. 9 men against the defending champions. The tournament had announced itself immediately. Cameroon went on to reach the quarterfinals, the best performance by an African nation at that point. Inspired by the performances of Roger Milla, a 38-year-old striker who had come out of retirement at the personal request of Cameroon's president and who celebrated every goal by dancing around the corner flag with a loose, joyful elegance that made him one of the most beloved figures of the tournament. The question of Roger Milla's exact age was mildly controversial. Cameroonian birth records from his era were not entirely reliable, and Milla himself occasionally seemed uncertain about exactly how old he was, which added to his somewhat mythological quality. The 1990 tournament as a whole was one of the most defensive in World Cup history. The average goals per match fell to 2.21, the lowest ever at that point. Several matches produced no goals at all. The final between Argentina and West Germany was a grim affair, decided by a penalty in the 85th minute and widely regarded as one of the worst World Cup finals ever played. West Germany won 1-0. Germany, reunified in 1990 following the fall of the Berlin Wall, had their 3rd World Cup title. Argentina were reduced to 9 men and had 2 players sent off. The Italian crowds booed through most of the final. It was not a glorious occasion. In response to the defensive football of 1990, FIFA introduced rule changes for the 1994 World Cup. Most notably, the back pass rule, which prevented goalkeepers from picking up the ball with their hands when it was intentionally kicked back to them by a teammate. This single change transformed the game more significantly than almost any other single rule amendment in football history. It forced teams to build from the back by playing through pressure rather than simply kicking the ball back to the goalkeeper whenever things got difficult. Goals began flowing more freely. The game opened up. And the 1994 tournament in the United States, the first World Cup held in North America, produced some of the most entertaining football in years. The United States hosting the World Cup in 1994 was, at the time, a controversial decision in the football world. The Americans were not a serious football nation. Their domestic professional league had collapsed in the early 1980s. The sport that the rest of the world simply called football was known in the United States as soccer, a name that the rest of the world found mildly amusing and slightly baffling. FIFA's decision to award the tournament to a country where football was essentially a minor sport was driven partly by the enormous commercial potential of the American market. The stadiums, the sponsorship deals, the television rights, and partly by the belief that hosting the World Cup would accelerate the growth of football in a country with 300 million people. The critics said American crowds would be small and uninterested. They were wrong on both counts. Attendance at the 1994 World Cup broke every previous record. The total attendance across the tournament was nearly 3.6 million, an average of over 68,000 per match, figures that have never been surpassed. The Americans, it turned out, could fill a stadium with considerable enthusiasm, even for a sport they did not fully understand. The heat in some venues, particularly Dallas and Orlando, was intense. Players and managers complained loudly about the scheduling and the conditions. But the tournament moved forward with a commercial energy and organizational efficiency that silenced most of the doubters. Brazil won the 1994 World Cup, ending a 24-year drought since their last title in Mexico in 1970. This Brazilian team was different from the ones that had won before. Less flamboyant, more pragmatic, built around defensive solidity and the counterattack rather than the freewheeling attacking brilliance of 1970. Their key players included Romario, a short, stocky, extraordinarily clinical striker who scored 5 goals in the tournament and had one of the sharpest football minds of his generation. And Bebeto, his striking partner, who scored 4 goals and celebrated one of them, against the Netherlands in the quarterfinal. With a rocking baby gesture that became one of the iconic images of the tournament, performed because his wife had just given birth to their son. The final against Italy in Pasadena was the first World Cup final in history to be decided by a penalty shootout after 120 minutes of play produced no goals. Italy's Roberto Baggio, one of the finest players of his era and the tournament's standout individual performer, stepped up to take the decisive fifth penalty, with Italy needing to score to stay alive. Baggio had scored every penalty he had taken in his career to that point. He ran up, struck the ball, and sent it sailing high over the crossbar. Brazil were world champions. Baggio stood with his head bowed, his hands on his knees, as the Brazilian celebrations erupted around him. The image of Baggio standing motionless in that moment, hair in a ponytail, expression unreadable, the ball somewhere in the seats, became one of the most replicated photographs in football history. Baggio later said that moment had haunted him for years. He described it as the worst of his life. For Brazil, it was their fourth World Cup title, equaling the record they had set in 1970, and it seemed to confirm their status as the greatest football nation in history, a status they would reinforce 4 years later in France and again in Japan and South Korea. The 1998 World Cup in France expanded to 32 teams for the first time, a significant structural change that opened the tournament to more nations from Africa, Asia, and the Americas than had ever participated before. It was the largest World Cup in history at that point, and it was held in a country that had never won the tournament despite consistently producing talented football players for decades. France in 1998 was not just a strong team. They were, on their day, an irresistible one. They had Zinedine Zidane, a midfielder born in Marseille to Algerian immigrant parents, technically gifted in a way that seemed almost supernatural, capable of controlling a football in tight spaces with both feet and his chest and his head with equal facility. A player whose vision and composure on the ball made complex situations look straightforward. They had Thierry Henry, a young winger of electric pace and technical quality. They had Patrick Vieira's physical authority in midfield, Marcel Desailly's commanding defensive presence, and Lilian Thuram's extraordinary versatility. The final against Brazil in Paris on July 12, 1998, was one of the most surreal in World Cup history, because for most of the build-up, it was dominated not by tactical analysis, but by questions about the health of one player. Ronaldo, the Brazilian striker who had been the best player on the planet for several years, a man of frightening pace and technical ability whose goals had powered Brazil through the tournament, was left off the team sheet for the final, then added back to it in circumstances that were never fully explained. Reports emerged that he had suffered some kind of seizure or convulsive fit in the team hotel the night before the match, and that despite this, he was selected to play. He was visibly not himself throughout the match. France won 3-0. Zidane scored twice with headers from corners in the first half, which was not a type of goal that Zidane was particularly associated with, and which made the victory feel slightly dreamlike. Emmanuel Petit added a third in the final minutes. France had their first World Cup title, in their own country, in a final against the defending champions, and the celebrations across France were extraordinary. An enormous, joyful, spontaneous outpouring that brought people of every background into the streets together in a moment of collective euphoria that seemed to briefly transcend all the social and political tensions that France, like every country, carried beneath its surface. The 2002 World Cup, co-hosted by Japan and South Korea, was the first held in Asia and produced upsets and surprises on a scale that the tournament had rarely seen before. The format of co-hosting two nations that were geographically separated required extraordinary logistical coordination. The time difference between Asia and Europe meant that many matches were played at difficult times for European television audiences, and the results suggested that the expanded tournament was producing exactly the kind of unpredictability that FIFA had hoped for. Senegal, appearing in their very first World Cup, played defending champions France in the opening match and won 1-0 through a goal from Papa Bouba Diop. France, who had also won the European Championship in 2000 and arrived as one of the tournament favorites, went home in the group stage without scoring a single goal. Senegal reached the quarterfinals. South Korea, the co-host, reached the semifinals, beating Spain and Italy along the way in circumstances that produced considerable controversy about the quality of refereeing decisions, making them the first Asian team to reach the last four of the World Cup. Historians still argue whether South Korea's 2002 run was purely a sporting achievement, or whether home advantage, questionable officiating, or FIFA favoritism toward the host nation played a role in their progress. The debate has never been fully resolved, and it has colored how the tournament is remembered in several of the countries that South Korea eliminated. Brazil won the 2002 tournament, beating Germany 2-0 in the final through 2 goals from Ronaldo, the same Ronaldo who had appeared so strangely diminished in the 1998 final. This Ronaldo, fully healthy and at the peak of his powers in 2002, was one of the most lethal strikers in the history of the game, and his performances across the tournament were devastating. He ended with 8 goals, winning the Golden Boot. Brazil had their 5th World Cup title, more than any other nation in history. The 2006 World Cup returned to Germany. The reunified, democratic, modern Germany of the 21st century rather than the divided country that had hosted the tournament in 1974. And the tournament produced a new generation of footballing heroes, a genuinely extraordinary final, and the most shocking single act of violence in World Cup history, committed not with a fist or a boot, but with a forehead. Germany in 2006 had spent years rebuilding their football infrastructure following a string of disappointing tournament performances in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Their investment in youth development academies, in coaching education, and in attracting talented players from their immigrant communities had begun to produce results, and a young, energetic German team playing exciting attacking football became one of the stories of the tournament. They did not win. They finished 3rd. But the atmosphere they generated, particularly in the knockout rounds played in packed, joyful German stadiums, was extraordinary. The tournament had a warmth and an openness to it that surprised many international visitors who arrived with preconceptions about Germany and left with genuinely different ones. Italy won the 2006 World Cup. Their route to the title was unconventional in the way that Italian football tends to be. Defensively organized, tactically precise, occasionally grinding, powered by the individual brilliance of players like Andrea Pirlo in midfield and the goal scoring of Fabio Grosso and Alessandro Del Piero in crucial moments. They beat France in the final on penalties after a 1-1 draw, in a match whose football will forever be overshadowed by what happened in the 110th minute. Zinedine Zidane was playing his final professional match. He had announced his retirement, and this final in Berlin was the last game of his career. He had scored France's goal with a chipped penalty in the first half, a penalty that struck the underside of the bar and dropped just over the line in one of the more nerve-wracking penalty kicks in final history. He had been magnificent throughout, a 34-year-old man playing with the authority and technique of someone 10 years younger, apparently heading toward a farewell performance that would cap his career on the highest possible note. And then Marco Materazzi said something to him. Materazzi, the Italian defender, had been involved in a physical exchange with Zidane throughout the match. In the 110th minute of extra time, as the two players jogged side by side, Materazzi spoke. Whatever he said, and there has been extensive analysis of lip-reading footage and considerable discussion from both parties about what was said, produced an immediate and devastating response. Zidane turned, walked back toward Materazzi, and headbutted him in the chest with full force. Materazzi went down. Zidane received a red card. He walked off the pitch past the World Cup trophy that was sitting beside the pitch, never looking at it, and disappeared into the tunnel. Zidane later confirmed that Materazzi had made serious insults about his mother and sister. Materazzi acknowledged saying something provocative, but has never fully disclosed the exact words. The footage of Zidane walking past the trophy without glancing at it became one of the most discussed images in sports history. The greatest player of his generation, in the final act of his career, walking away from the prize he had spent his life pursuing because someone had insulted his family. Italy won the penalty shootout. France's David Trezeguet, who had scored the golden goal in the Euro 2000 final, struck his penalty against the crossbar. Italy were world champions for the 4th time. The 2010 World Cup made history by moving to Africa for the first time, held in South Africa in a tournament that carried enormous political and cultural significance. Nelson Mandela attended the opening ceremony. The sound of vuvuzelas, plastic horns blown by supporters with a volume and continuity that divided opinion sharply among broadcasters and fans, became the sonic signature of the tournament. Some people found the constant drone irritating. Others found it electric and exhilarating. Nobody who watched any of those South African matches will ever forget the sound. The tournament produced one of the most genuine surprises in the modern era when Spain emerged as champions. Spain had been considered an underachieving football nation for decades. They had produced world-class players consistently, but had never won a World Cup despite their talent. Under coach Vicente Del Bosque, playing a possession-based passing style that their players had refined at club level, particularly at Barcelona, Spain defeated the Netherlands 1-0 in the final through a goal by Andres Iniesta in the 116th minute of extra time, the latest decisive goal in a World Cup final history. Iniesta's goal was celebrated in a way that added an extra dimension to the moment. He removed his shirt to reveal a message written underneath, "Donny Jarque always with us." Jarque had been Iniesta's teammate and close friend at Barcelona's youth academy, who had died of a heart attack at 26 years old. Iniesta was booked for removing his shirt and did not seem to notice or care. He was crying. A nation of 46 million people was crying with him. Spain's victory was part of an unprecedented run of international success. They had won Euro 2008, the 2010 World Cup, and would go on to win Euro 2012, becoming the only team to win 3 consecutive major international tournaments. Their tiki-taka style of play, short passing, high pressing, relentless movement, became the most discussed and imitated tactical approach in world football, adopted and adapted by coaches at every level across the globe. The 2010 World Cup also gave the world Paul the Octopus. Paul was a common octopus living in a tank at a sea life center in Oberhausen, Germany, who had been used to predict match results in previous tournaments by choosing between 2 boxes of food, each one labeled with a competing nation's flag. For the 2010 World Cup, Paul correctly predicted the outcomes of all 7 of Germany's matches, plus the final between Spain and the Netherlands. He achieved a 100% accuracy rate across 8 predictions. He became an international celebrity. Several nations whose teams he had predicted to lose reportedly threatened him with various forms of culinary revenge. Paul died in October 2010 of natural causes, presumably without regret. His accuracy rate remains unexplained and will almost certainly remain so. Historians still argue whether Paul's correct predictions represented genuine pattern recognition ability in a sophisticated cephalopod, extraordinary coincidence, or something else entirely. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and football is perhaps richer for containing this mystery. The 2014 World Cup returned to Brazil, the first time Brazil had hosted the tournament since 1950 in the Maracanazo. The emotional weight was enormous. Brazil had spent 64 years trying to exorcise the ghost of that afternoon when 200,000 people fell silent in the Maracanã. Now they were hosting again, playing at home again, and the expectation was that this time they would finally put the memory of 1950 to rest. What happened instead was arguably worse. Brazil reached the semifinals, where they faced Germany without their injured striker Neymar, their best player and the tournament's emerging star, who had been ruled out with a fractured vertebra suffered in the quarterfinal. They also played without their captain Thiago Silva, who was suspended. The match was played at the Estadio Mineirão in Belo Horizonte, ironically, close to the city where the United States had beaten England in 1950. Germany scored in the 11th minute. They scored again in the 23rd minute, in the 24th minute, in the 26th minute, in the 29th minute. Brazil had conceded 4 goals in 6 minutes of football. The Brazilian crowd fell silent in a way that seemed to echo the silence of the Maracanã in 1950. Germany scored again in the 69th minute and the 79th minute. Brazil scored a consolation in the 90th minute. Final score, Germany 7, Brazil 1. The result became known as the Mineirazo, the Belo Horizonte equivalent of the Maracanazo. Brazilian players wept on the pitch. Supporters in the stands wept in the stands. The internet, which had not existed in 1950, responded with a speed and creativity and volume that produced thousands of memes, tributes, jokes, and expressions of disbelief within minutes of the final whistle. The 7-1 became the most discussed single result in football history for the weeks that followed. Germany went on to beat Argentina 1-0 in the final through a goal by substitute Mario Götze in extra time, winning their 4th World Cup title. Brazil finished 4th, their worst result since 1940. The Minorazo joined the Maracanazo in the National Sporting Trauma Register, 2 enormous wounds separated by 64 years, but connected by the same fundamental story. Brazil, at home, in front of their own people, falling short when it mattered most. The 2018 World Cup in Russia produced the kind of tournament that reminds you why the World Cup exists. Full of surprises, full of drama, full of moments that seem to have been scripted by someone with a flair for the theatrical and a complete disregard for what the pre-tournament predictions said was supposed to happen. The host nation, Russia, ranked 70th in the world going into the tournament and widely expected to exit early, won their group, beat Spain in the round of 16 on penalties, and reached the quarterfinals before losing to Croatia. Germany, the reigning world champions who arrived in Russia, having won the 2017 Confederations Cup, and who were widely considered among the favorites, were eliminated in the group stage. One of the biggest collective failures by a defending champion in tournament history. They lost to South Korea in their final group match with goals scored by players who were already on the pitch, celebrating a different kind of victory when the South Korean goals went in. They went home having not made it out of the group stage. The German football establishment spent the following months in a thorough and somewhat agonized examination of what had gone wrong. In their place, teams that nobody had predicted would go deep made extraordinary runs. Croatia reached the final, powered by the midfield brilliance of Luka Modric, a small, technically perfect player who had grown up in wartime Croatia and had developed an extraordinary football intelligence that made him one of the best players of his generation, despite never possessing the physical intimidation that many coaches demand from midfielders. Morocco, though they did not match what they would achieve 4 years later, showed flashes of quality. Belgium had perhaps their best team ever assembled and reached the semifinals, only to lose to France in a match that felt like a genuine injustice to many neutral observers. Uruguay, Japan, and Senegal all produced moments of genuine quality before exiting. France won the 2018 World Cup, defeating Croatia 4-2 in the final in Moscow. The French squad was extraordinary in its depth and its youth. Kylian Mbappé, the 20-year-old Paris Saint-Germain forward, became only the second teenager after Pelé to score in a World Cup final, and he played with a pace and directness that suggested football had found its next dominant figure. The French team reflected the multicultural reality of modern France in a way that was both genuinely remarkable and occasionally used as a political football by various parties with various agendas. Most of their most important players were the children or grandchildren of immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, products of the French banlieues and the football academies that had systematically developed talent from those communities. Mbappé, born in Bondy, in a suburb of Paris, to a Cameroonian father and an Algerian mother, was the symbol of this new France. Fast, confident, unafraid of the biggest moments, already valued at hundreds of millions of euros before his 21st birthday. He had grown up with a poster of Cristiano Ronaldo on his wall and had modeled his game in part on the pace and directness of the Portuguese superstar, while developing his own instincts and intelligence that made him something entirely original. The 2018 tournament also introduced video assistant referee technology, VAR, to the World Cup for the first time. VAR allowed match officials to review decisions using video footage, correcting clear errors that had previously stood unchallenged. The technology immediately became one of the most controversial additions to football in living memory, generating enormous argument about which situations warranted review, how long reviews should take, what constituted a clear error versus a judgment call, and whether the human drama of football. The immediate, visceral, unmediated experience of a moment was being diluted by the interruption of play for lengthy video reviews. One reasonable joke that circulated during the 2018 tournament: fans stopped celebrating goals immediately after they went in, waiting to confirm via referee signal that VAR had not overturned the decision before committing fully to their jubilation. This somewhat reduced the spontaneous joy of goal celebrations, which are one of football's most reliably wonderful human moments. FIFA noted the concern. The technology remained. And then there was Qatar in 2022, the most controversial tournament in World Cup history. Not because of what happened on the pitch, which was extraordinary, but because of everything surrounding it. Qatar is a small, extremely wealthy country in the Persian Gulf, whose summer temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. It was awarded the hosting rights to the 2022 World Cup by FIFA in a vote in 2010 that was immediately surrounded by allegations of corruption, bribery, and improper influence. Over the following years, investigations in multiple countries produced evidence of payments to FIFA officials, and several officials were eventually prosecuted and convicted of corruption-related offenses. The question of whether Qatar's bid was awarded on merit or on the basis of financial inducements was never definitively answered in a court of law, but the weight of evidence suggested that merit alone was unlikely to have been the deciding factor. Qatar could not host the tournament in summer. The heat would have been genuinely dangerous for players and spectators. So the World Cup was moved to November and December, the first time in its history that the tournament had been held in the Northern Hemisphere's winter. This caused significant disruption to European domestic football leagues, who had never before been required to pause their seasons in the middle of November for a month-long international tournament. The clubs were not happy. The broadcasters had to rearrange significant portions of their schedules. Nobody had quite fully thought through the downstream consequences of awarding the tournament to a country where the normal scheduling was physically impossible. Qatar also faced severe and sustained criticism for its human rights record, particularly the treatment of the migrant workers who had built the tournament's infrastructure. Stadiums, hotels, transport networks, and entire cities had been constructed by workers from South Asia and elsewhere, many of whom had been recruited through a system that restricted their freedom to leave jobs or employers, and many of whom had died in workplace accidents or from heat-related illness. The precise number of deaths was disputed, with different organizations producing estimates ranging from dozens to thousands, and the Qatari government disputed the higher figures. But the human cost of the tournament's physical construction was real, and it generated sustained international media coverage that placed Qatar's World Cup under a level of ethical scrutiny that no previous tournament had experienced. And then the football began. And the football was astonishing. Saudi Arabia beat Argentina 2-1. Japan beat Germany and Spain. Morocco beat Belgium and defeated Spain and Portugal on their way to the semifinals, becoming the first African nation to reach the last four of a World Cup and winning the hearts of neutrals across the world with their combination of defensive organization, physical intensity, and technical quality. The noise that Moroccan supporters generated in the stands, a sound rooted in North African musical traditions, ululating and rhythmic and completely unlike anything the World Cup had heard before, became one of the defining sounds of the tournament. And in the final, something happened that many people who were watching felt could not be real. A sporting drama so compressed and so perfectly structured that it seemed to belong to fiction rather than fact. The final of the 2022 World Cup at the Lusail Iconic Stadium in Qatar on December 18th is already being discussed as the greatest single football match ever played. That is a large claim, and football history is full of extraordinary matches. But the case is compelling. Argentina came into the final as favorites. Lionel Messi, 35 years old, had announced that this was his final World Cup. He had won every other trophy the game could offer. Multiple Champions Leagues, multiple La Liga titles, a Copa America in 2021 that had ended Argentina's 28-year wait for a major international title. He had won 7 Ballon d'Or awards, more than any player in history. The one thing that had eluded him, the one hole in a career otherwise without parallel in the modern era, was the World Cup. He had reached the final in 2014 and lost. He had been eliminated at various stages of earlier tournaments in circumstances that had generated genuine anguish among his supporters and genuine doubts in the minds of some observers about whether he had the force of will to deliver on the biggest stage when it mattered most. France came in as defending champions, with Kylian Mbappé in the form of his life and a squad of quality that had beaten England in the quarterfinals and Morocco in the semifinals. Their coach Didier Deschamps was a pragmatic organizer who knew how to win tournaments. France had won in 1998 and 2018, and a third title would make them only the third nation ever to win 3 World Cups. The match began and Argentina dominated. Messi put Argentina ahead from the penalty spot. Angel Di Maria added a second with a composed finish after a flowing team move. Argentina led 2-0. France had barely existed as an attacking force. Mbappé, the world's most dangerous forward, had been virtually invisible. And then, in the 80th minute, everything changed. France won a penalty. Mbappé stepped up and converted it. A minute later, Mbappé struck a stunning volley. First time, barely any backlift, hit with extraordinary technique, that flew into the top corner. In the space of 97 seconds, France had gone from 0-2 down to 2-2. Mbappé had scored twice in under 2 minutes. The world watching on television had the sensation of having been hit by something very fast, moving from a direction they had not anticipated. Extra time produced more drama. Messi scored in the 108th minute to put Argentina 3-2 ahead. Messi at 35 in a World Cup final in extra time! The image of Messi celebrating that goal, running toward the corner flag, his face a mixture of relief and joy, and something that looked very much like the release of a long-held tension, was already one of the iconic photographs of the tournament. Mbappé scored again in the 118th minute, 3-3, his third goal of the night. The first hat trick in a World Cup final in 56 years, since Geoff Hurst for England against West Germany in 1966. The match went to a penalty shootout for the third time in World Cup final history. Argentina goalkeeper Emiliano Martinez, who had been outstanding throughout the tournament and who had an unconventional and slightly theatrical approach to penalty situations that involved a great deal of attempted psychological disruption of opposing kickers, saved 2 French penalties. Argentina scored 4 of their 5. France's Kingsley Coman and Aurélien Tchouameni missed. Argentina won the 2022 World Cup, their third title, Messi's first. He walked up to receive the trophy draped in a bisht, a traditional Qatari black and gold ceremonial robe placed over his shoulders by the Emir of Qatar in a gesture that generated both admiration and some controversy, as some felt the robe obscured the most important football moment of the decade. Messi did not appear to care about the controversy. He held the trophy. He had been waiting for this his entire career. The French football journalist Vincent Deluc wrote that evening that Mbappé had scored a hat trick in a World Cup final and lost. The peculiar cruelty of sport had been on full display. Mbappé had done everything a player could do and still ended up on the losing side. He was 23 years old. He would presumably be at the next World Cup and several more after that. Now, let us step back from the individual tournaments for a moment and think about the broader patterns that the World Cup's history reveals. Because the 90-plus years of this competition, when you look at them together, tell a story about football and about the world that goes beyond any single match or any single player. The first pattern is geography. In the World Cup's first 40 years, only 8 nations won the tournament, and all of them were from either South America or Western Europe. Uruguay, Italy, West Germany, Brazil, England, Argentina. The trophy essentially circulated among a small club of traditional football powers. Outside these nations, the World Cup was something you watched rather than won. That pattern has been disrupted slowly and partially over the decades. Japan and South Korea co-hosted in 2002. The tournament has been held in Africa and in the Middle East. Nations from outside the traditional heartlands have produced great moments and great players, but the winners list remains stubbornly concentrated. Only 8 nations have won the World Cup in its entire history. Brazil with 5, Germany and Italy with 4 each, Argentina with 3, France with 2, Uruguay, England, and Spain with 1 each. The second pattern is the way the tournament reflects the political world around it. The 1934 and 1938 tournaments were held in Mussolini's Italy and under the shadow of European fascism. The 1978 tournament was held in Argentina under a military dictatorship. The 2022 tournament was held in Qatar amid serious human rights concerns. Each of these situations generated debate about whether sport should be separated from politics, whether athletes and fans had a responsibility to protest, and whether FIFA's commercial priorities had overridden moral considerations. Those debates have never been resolved because they reflect genuine tensions that do not have clean answers. The third pattern is expansion. The 1930 tournament had 13 teams. By 1938, it had 16. By 1982, it had 24. By 1998, it had 32. And in 2026, it will have 48, the largest expansion in the competition's history. Each expansion has been accompanied by debates about whether more teams dilutes the quality of competition, whether the later rounds become less special when the path to them is easier, and whether giving more nations the chance to participate strengthens or weakens the tournament as a sporting event. FIFA's position is that the expansion strengthens football globally by bringing more nations into the world's most important competition and inspiring development in countries where the game has not traditionally been strong. The fourth pattern, and perhaps the most important, is the pattern of the unexpected. Every World Cup, without exception, produces moments that nobody predicted and results that defy the logic of rankings and reputations. The United States beating England in 1950. North Korea beating Italy in 1966. Cameroon beating Argentina in 1990. Senegal beating France in 2002. Saudi Arabia beating Argentina in 2022. The tournament has an extraordinary capacity to produce the improbable, and it is precisely this capacity that makes it the most watched sporting event on earth. The reason football produces these upsets more reliably than almost any other team sport is mathematical. Low-scoring games are inherently less predictable than high-scoring ones. In basketball, where scores routinely reach 100 points, the better team wins almost every time because the sample size of scoring opportunities is large enough to smooth out random variation. In football, where a match might produce 3 or 4 genuine scoring chances for each team, a single moment of individual brilliance or individual error can change everything. The better team does not always win. The worst team sometimes does. And in the World Cup, where the stakes are enormous and a single defeat sends you home, those moments of improbability are amplified to the scale of national tragedy or national ecstasy. This is why billions of people watch. Not because they know what will happen, because they genuinely do not know. Before we move into the era of the great individual players in more detail, because the World Cup has produced a gallery of human beings whose talent was so extraordinary that they deserve real time and real attention. Let us spend a moment with the tournament's most dramatic structural element, the one that reduces grown adults to covering their eyes, to pacing the room, to making promises to deities they are not sure they believe in. The penalty shootout. Nothing in sport quite replicates the experience of watching a penalty shootout in a World Cup knockout match. Not the final moments of a close basketball game, not the last over of a tied cricket match, not the final seconds of a tied American football game. Nothing. Because the penalty shootout combines the individual and the collective in a way that is uniquely, almost sadistically, pressurized. A penalty is, in theory, a relatively simple task. The ball is placed 12 yards from the goal. The goal is 8 yards wide and 8 feet tall. The goalkeeper must guess which direction the kicker will go and commit to that direction before the ball is struck. On a training pitch, professional footballers score penalties from 12 yards with something approaching 90% reliability. The physics strongly favor the kicker. And yet in a World Cup shootout, with every player in both squads watching from the center circle, with 80,000 people in the stadium on their feet, with hundreds of millions of television viewers in every time zone on Earth watching simultaneously, with the knowledge that missing means your country goes home. In that context, the simple task becomes something else entirely. Legs that have spent decades being trained to move reliably and powerfully suddenly feel uncertain. Minds that have processed thousands of decisions correctly in matches begin to hesitate at precisely the wrong moment. Roberto Baggio in 1994. David Beckham had never taken a penalty in a World Cup shootout, but he missed a crucial one for England against Portugal in 2006, and the image of his face afterwards spoke of genuine personal anguish. Stuart Pearce and Chris Waddle for England against West Germany in 1990. Gareth Southgate for England against Germany in 1996. Not a World Cup, but burned into the English sporting consciousness with an intensity that shaped his entire career and, remarkably, brought him back as England's manager decades later. Football has a very long memory for these moments, and the people who experience them carry them for a very long time. The penalty shootout was introduced to the World Cup in 1978 for potential use, and was first actually used in 1982, when West Germany beat France in the semifinals in what many football historians consider the moment the shootout entered football's consciousness as both a tactical challenge and an existential drama. France had been the better team across 120 minutes and led 3-1 in extra time before West Germany fought back to equalize. In the shootout, the French goalkeeper Didier Six missed. German goalkeeper Harald Schumacher saved from Maxime Bossis. West Germany went through. French players wept. French supporters wept. Platini, France's brilliant playmaker, sat on the pitch with his head in his hands. The penalty shootout has decided World Cup semifinals and finals with a regularity that ensures it remains central to the tournament's drama. Argentina versus the Netherlands in 1998. France versus Italy in 2006. Argentina versus France in 2022. Each time, the same terrible simplicity. 11 players, 12 yards, a goalkeeper, and the pressure of a nation's hopes reduced to a single moment of individual decision-making. One genuinely unusual fact about penalty shootouts that most people do not know. Research by sports psychologists has consistently found that the team that shoots first in a shootout wins significantly more often than the team that shoots second. The psychological pressure of having to respond to a successful kick by the opposing team, of always being the side playing catch-up, appears to be measurably disadvantageous. Several football associations have lobbied FIFA to change the format of shootouts to reduce this asymmetry, suggesting alternating which team shoots first, similar to the ABBA format used in some competitions. FIFA has so far not adopted this change for the World Cup. Now let us talk about the players. Because the World Cup is also, fundamentally, a stage on which individual human talent has been displayed at its highest level, and the gallery of great players who have illuminated this tournament across 9 decades is one of the most remarkable collections of athletic achievement in human history. We have already spent time with Pelé and Maradona and Messi. But the World Cup has produced extraordinary performances from dozens of other players who deserve their own moments of recognition. Just Fontaine, a Moroccan-born French striker who scored 13 goals at the 1958 World Cup in Sweden, a record that still stands today, more than 65 years later, and that many football historians believe will never be broken. 13 goals in 6 matches. He scored 4 in France's third-place playoff win over West Germany. He achieved this record in his only World Cup. He suffered a serious injury and never appeared in another tournament. 13 goals at 1 World Cup, and that is his entire World Cup career. His record is one of the most extraordinary individual achievements in the tournament's history. Eusebio. The Mozambican-born Portuguese striker who illuminated the 1966 World Cup in England with 9 goals, including 4 in a single quarterfinal match against North Korea, after Portugal had fallen 3-0 behind in the first 25 minutes in one of the most dramatic turnarounds in tournament history. Eusebio's pace, his power, his ability to strike the ball with either foot, and his emotional expressiveness made him one of the most compelling players the tournament had seen. He wept openly when Portugal were eliminated in the semifinal by England. He was not embarrassed by those tears. He had the confidence of someone who knew his talent was real. Gerd Muller. A short, stocky West German striker who scored 14 goals across 2 World Cups, 10 in 1970 and 4 in 1974, at an average of slightly more than 1 per match. He was not elegant. he did not look like an athlete in the way that some of his contemporaries did. He was built low and wide, with a remarkable sense of where the ball would arrive in the penalty area and an almost predatory instinct for finishing that made him one of the deadliest goal scorers of any era. Franz Beckenbauer. The only man to win the World Cup as both a player and as a manager. He won as West Germany's captain in 1974, conducting the game from a defensive position with an authority and vision that had not been seen from a defender before. He won as manager in 1990. He was nicknamed Der Kaiser, the Emperor, and the title was not ironic. Johann Cruyff, who never won the World Cup, but whose influence on how football is played and thought about is arguably greater than that of many who did. His total football philosophy became the foundation on which multiple generations of coaches. Most importantly, Pep Guardiola, who learned his football at Barcelona and who has taken Cruyff's ideas into the 21st century, have built their systems. Ronaldo Nazario, known as Ronaldo, or occasionally as the original Ronaldo, or R9, to distinguish him from Cristiano Ronaldo, who won the World Cup twice, in 1994 and 2002, and whose peak in the mid to late 1990s represented a form of attacking play that combined pace, power, technique, and finishing ability in proportions that had rarely been seen. His 2002 tournament, when he scored 8 goals, was a redemption story following the strange circumstances of the 1998 final, and his performances against England in the quarterfinal and against Germany in the final were among the finest individual displays in World Cup history. Miroslav Klose, a German striker of Polish origin who scored 16 goals across 4 World Cups, 2002, 2006, 2010, and 2014, making him the all-time leading scorer in World Cup history, overtaking Ronaldo's 15 goals with a header against Brazil in the 2014 semifinal, the match that ended 7-1. He celebrated with a somersault, as he had done throughout his career, performing a precise aerial rotation before landing cleanly on his feet. He scored 16 goals at World Cups, and he celebrated almost all of them by doing a somersault, which is one of the more endearing personal customs in the tournament's history. Historians still argue whether Klose's 16 goals, accumulated steadily across 4 tournaments over 12 years, or just Fontaine's 13 goals in 6 matches at a single tournament represents the more extraordinary individual scoring achievement. The arguments for Fontaine's 13 are compelling in their intensity. The arguments for Klose's 16 are compelling in their longevity. The World Cup has always been about more than football. It has been a mirror held up to the world, reflecting back the politics, the economics, the social forces, and the human stories of whatever era it is being played in. To watch the World Cup is to watch the world argue about itself in the most public possible arena, with the added dimension that the argument occasionally produces something of such beauty that even the people losing the argument forget, for a moment, that they are losing. The political dimension of the tournament begins almost at the beginning. The 1934 and 1938 tournaments were both held in Mussolini's Italy, and the Italian dictator used them openly and deliberately as instruments of national propaganda. The Italian team, successful in both tournaments, was photographed giving fascist salutes. The tournament was embedded in a political project. Whether FIFA was complicit or simply naive or simply indifferent is a question that historians have debated for decades without fully resolving. The 1978 tournament in Argentina is the clearest example of a World Cup being used as a propaganda instrument by a government engaged in systematic human rights violations. The Argentine military junta that had seized power in 1976 saw the World Cup as an opportunity to demonstrate national strength and stability to the outside world, while simultaneously conducting what is now well documented as a campaign of disappearances, torture, and murder against political opponents. The Dutch team debated boycotting the tournament. Several players and officials from various nations raised concerns. The tournament went ahead. Argentina won. The military leaders celebrated openly and publicly with the national team. The players who lifted the trophy were celebrated as national heroes in a context that some of them later acknowledged with discomfort. One Argentine midfielder from that squad, Osvaldo Ardiles, later admitted that the circumstances of the 1978 victory had been complicated, and that he had not always felt entirely comfortable discussing it. The general debate about whether sport can be separated from the political conditions under which it is staged, whether athletes bear responsibility for the political uses made of their victories by the governments hosting them, does not have a clean answer, and the 1978 World Cup is the argument's most frequently cited exhibit. The Cold War shaped the World Cup in ways that were sometimes obvious and sometimes subtle. The Soviet Union and its satellite states participated in the tournament from the 1950s onward, and matches between Eastern Bloc and Western nations carried a political weight that the players and supporters were all aware of. When the Soviet Union beat England in the 1958 World Cup, English newspapers interpreted the result partly through a Cold War lens. When the United States played any match, the outcome was discussed in geopolitical terms as well as sporting ones. The 1966 North Korea story deserves more attention than it usually receives because it is one of the most extraordinary stories in the tournament's history from every perspective: sporting, political, and human. North Korea, a deeply isolated communist state, qualified for the World Cup in England and then proceeded to beat Italy 1-0, knocking a two-time world champion out of the group stage, in a result that sent shockwaves through the football world. The team then reached the quarterfinal before losing to Portugal 5-3 in a match where they had led 3-0 at one point. Their players were virtually unknown outside their country. Some of them had been identified through military football programs rather than through professional leagues. They played with a collective discipline and a fearlessness that made them one of the most admired teams of the tournament. When they returned to North Korea, they were not publicly celebrated. In a country where failure was not tolerated and where a defeat to capitalist Portugal after leading 3-0 might be considered a form of ideological collapse, the reception was complicated. Some accounts suggest players faced criticism or worse on their return. The full story of what happened to the 1966 North Korean squad after the tournament has never been fully documented. Historians still argue about the fate of those players after their return home, with some accounts suggesting punishment and others suggesting they were received positively for their earlier victories. The mystery adds a melancholy dimension to what was otherwise a purely wonderful underdog story. The question of money is impossible to ignore in any serious discussion of the World Cup's history. Jules Rimet's original tournament in 1930 was financed partly by Uruguay's extraordinary generosity in paying the travel and accommodation costs of all participating teams. It was, by the standards of modern sports finance, almost impossibly modest. A collection of nations playing football in a small South American country with a gold statuette as the prize. The economic scale of the tournament has grown in a way that would have been unimaginable to Jules Rimet. The 2022 Qatar World Cup generated an estimated $7.5 billion in revenue for FIFA. The broadcast rights alone, the fees paid by television networks around the world for the right to show the matches, represent sums that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who organized the 1930 tournament. Sponsorship deals with global corporations add further layers of financial complexity. The stadiums that Qatar built for the 2022 tournament cost an estimated $220 billion in total infrastructure investment. This financial scale has created a FIFA that is a genuinely powerful global organization with interests and relationships across dozens of countries, and it has also created conditions in which financial corruption became, for a period in the organization's history, systemic rather than exceptional. The FIFA corruption scandal that became fully public in 2015, when United States Department of Justice indictments revealed a pattern of bribery and financial misconduct involving dozens of football officials across multiple decades, was not a sudden revelation to everyone who had been paying attention. Allegations of corruption in the awarding of hosting rights had circulated for years. But the scale of what the indictments revealed, the breadth of the corruption, the number of officials involved, the length of time it had been happening, was genuinely shocking even to those who had suspected the worst. Several senior FIFA officials were convicted of corruption-related offenses. The organization underwent significant structural reform. Its long-serving president, Sepp Blatter, who had run FIFA for 17 years and under whose tenure the corruption had flourished, resigned in 2015 and was subsequently banned from football by FIFA's own ethics committee. His successor, Gianni Infantino, initiated reforms but also became a source of controversy in his own right, particularly regarding the circumstances under which he relocated to Qatar before the 2022 tournament and his close relationship with the Qatari government. The corruption scandal raised fundamental questions about the governance of the most popular sport on earth, about who should have the power to decide where the World Cup is held, about how that power should be exercised and checked, about whether a privately governed organization like FIFA should be subject to more external oversight. Those questions have not been fully answered. The World Cup continues. The money continues to flow. The reform process continues, imperfectly and partially. Yet it would be wrong and dishonest to allow the financial and political complexity of the World Cup's history to overshadow what makes the tournament genuinely and irreducibly important. The World Cup matters because football matters. And football matters because it is one of the few genuinely universal human activities, played on every continent, in every culture, by children and adults of every economic background, requiring nothing more than a ball and a flat surface and people who want to play. The World Cup at its best. The moments that have made billions of people stop what they were doing and watch together. Has produced something real and valuable. It has produced the feeling of shared experience across national and cultural boundaries. It has produced moments of physical and technical beauty that belong to the human species as a whole, regardless of which nation the player scoring or creating them represented. It has produced stories of perseverance and triumph that connect with something deep in human nature. When Iniesta scored in extra time in the 2010 final and removed his shirt to reveal a tribute to his dead friend, the people watching in Spain and in South Africa and around the world were not just watching a football match. They were watching a human being at the peak of his abilities, honor someone he had loved and lost. When Messi lifted the trophy in Qatar in December 2022, the people watching were responding to something that transcended sport. The sight of a man who had dedicated his entire life to a pursuit, finally achieving the thing that had eluded him for 2 decades. These are human stories dressed in football kit, and the World Cup is the stage on which they play out at their most intense and their most public. The women's game deserves its own chapter in the World Cup story, and it is a chapter that has been written with remarkable speed and remarkable quality, considering how recently it began. The FIFA Women's World Cup was established in 1991, 61 years after the first men's tournament, and its history, compressed into just over 3 decades, mirrors in accelerated form the trajectory of the men's game across 90 years. It began with limited participation and modest attention. It has grown into one of the most watched sporting events in the world. It has produced players of extraordinary talent whose names belong alongside the great names of the men's game in any honest account of football's history. The first Women's World Cup was held in China in 1991 with 12 teams. The United States won it, beating Norway 2-1 in the final with Michelle Akers scoring both American goals. Akers was one of the most complete midfielders of her generation. Powerful, technically gifted, capable of dominating matches through sheer force of will as much as through technical quality. She won the 1991 tournament and then the 1999 tournament, bookending a decade of American dominance in the women's game. The 1999 Women's World Cup in the United States is the tournament that changed everything for women's football globally. The United States hosted, and what followed was a commercial and cultural moment that nobody had predicted. Stadiums that most people had assumed would be half empty were full. The Rose Bowl in Pasadena, the same stadium where Brazil had beaten Italy in the men's 1994 final, hosted the women's final between the United States and China with a crowd of 90,185 people, the largest attendance ever recorded for a women's sporting event at that time. The match ended 0-0 after extra time and went to a penalty shootout. Brandi Chastain scored the winning penalty for the United States, and her celebration. Falling to her knees, removing her jersey, swinging it above her head, her face showing pure ecstatic release, became one of the most iconic sports photographs of the 20th century. The image appeared on the cover of major magazines. It was discussed, analyzed, celebrated, and occasionally criticized with an intensity that said as much about the cultural moment as it did about the football. Mia Hamm was the face of American women's football in this era, a forward of extraordinary technical quality and competitive intensity whose Nike advertising campaigns had helped make women's football visible to audiences who had never previously paid attention. She was paired in public consciousness with Michael Jordan as one of the defining American sports figures of the 1990s, which was a remarkable thing for a women's footballer to achieve in a country where football was still developing as a sport. The 2003 Women's World Cup was relocated from China to the United States following the SARS outbreak, and Germany won it for the first time, beginning a period of German dominance that saw them win back-to-back titles in 2003 and 2007, with a team built around powerful, technically accomplished players and a physical athleticism that set new standards for the women's game. The 2011 Women's World Cup in Germany produced one of the most dramatic finals in the tournament's history. Japan, a nation not previously associated with football success at the highest level, faced the United States in the final and pulled off an upset of genuine quality. The match was tied at 2-2 after extra time. Japan won the penalty shootout. Japan were world champions. The tournament came just months after the devastating earthquake and tsunami that had struck Japan in March 2011, killing nearly 20,000 people and triggering the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And the Japanese team's victory was absorbed by their country as a moment of collective joy and resilience in the midst of national trauma. The players and their coach spoke openly about wanting to give their country something to celebrate, and the timing of their victory gave it an emotional resonance that extended far beyond football. The United States won the 2015 and 2019 Women's World Cups, with the 2019 final against the Netherlands featuring what many consider the finest individual performance in Women's World Cup history. Megan Rapinoe scoring twice and winning both the Golden Boot and the Golden Ball, conducting herself throughout the tournament with a confidence and political outspokenness that made her one of the most discussed athletes in the world in 2019, regardless of sport or gender. Rapinoe used her platform explicitly to advocate for equal pay for the women's national team, for LGBTQ rights, and for various other causes, generating both enormous support and significant controversy, and demonstrating that the World Cup stage remained, as it had always been, a place where individual human beings could speak to the world in ways that extended beyond the game itself. The Women's World Cup expanded to 24 teams in 2015 and to 32 teams in 2023, when Australia and New Zealand co-hosted. The 2023 tournament produced extraordinary moments, including Morocco's becoming the first African women's team to reach the knockout rounds, Jamaica's historic participation, and co-host Australia's run to the semifinals that generated the kind of national football fever the country had rarely experienced. England reached the final before losing to Spain 1-0, with Olga Carmona's first-half goal proving decisive. Spain won their first Women's World Cup, and Carmona's personal story. Her father had died the morning of the final, though she did not learn of it until after the match, added a dimension of human complexity to the victory that made it genuinely moving beyond the sporting achievement. The growth of the Women's World Cup in terms of viewership, investment, and global attention has been remarkable. The 2023 tournament's final between England and Spain was watched by approximately 400 million people globally. Prize money for women's teams has increased substantially, though it remains significantly below the prize money available to men's teams, a disparity that continues to generate significant debate about equality and investment priorities within FIFA and within national football associations. Historians still argue about whether women's football has received the financial investment and institutional support that the quality of play and the size of the audience it can attract would justify, with critics pointing to decades of underinvestment by football's governing bodies and supporters of the current trajectory pointing to the rate of growth in recent years as evidence that the gap is closing. The parallel existence of the men's and women's World Cups reflects a broader truth about the tournament's place in global culture. The World Cup has become a platform for the world's conversations about itself, about politics, about economics, about gender, about race, about national identity, about corruption and accountability, about joy and grief, and the strange way that sport can make millions of people feel the same thing at the same moment. It is simultaneously a commercial enterprise of enormous scale, a genuine sporting competition of the highest quality, a political instrument that states and organizations use to pursue their own interests, and an authentic expression of the human love of play and competition. None of those things cancel out the others. The World Cup is all of them at once. That is part of what makes it so endlessly fascinating to study and so endlessly compelling to watch. The cities that have hosted World Cup matches carry the memory of what happened there. The Maracana in Rio de Janeiro holds the ghost of the Maracanazo. The Azteca Stadium in Mexico City holds the memory of Maradona's 2 goals in 1986 on the same pitch where Carlos Alberto had scored that team goal in the 1970 final. Wembley holds England's 1966 victory and decades of near misses since. The Lusail Stadium in Qatar holds the memory of Messi finally lifting the trophy he had spent his career working toward. These buildings are archives of human experience as much as they are sporting venues, and the football that has been played in them has left traces that persist long after the last supporter has gone home. The experience of actually attending a World Cup match, of being physically present in a stadium when the tournament is happening, is something that people who have done it describe in remarkably similar terms, regardless of where in the world they are from or which team they were supporting. They describe a feeling of scale and belonging simultaneously, of being one small part of an enormous collective experience, while also feeling the full weight of each moment personally. They describe the noise as something you feel in your chest rather than just hear with your ears. They describe the way time seems to compress and expand unpredictably, so that a goalless 30 minutes passes in what feels like 5 and a single penalty kick seems to take several minutes. Football stadiums at World Cup matches have an atmosphere that is shaped by the mixing of supporter cultures from different countries in ways that rarely happen in domestic football. A group stage match between 2 nations might bring supporters from both countries side by side in the stands, along with neutral fans from a dozen other nations who are simply there to watch good football. The cultural exchange that happens in those stands, the sharing of songs, the comparative study of how different fan communities express themselves, the discovery that what seemed like a uniquely local tradition of support is actually universal in its emotional logic, is one of the things that makes the World Cup experience genuinely different from any other sporting event. The World Cup has also shaped the way football is broadcast, discussed, and consumed globally. The first World Cup to be broadcast on television was the 1954 tournament in Switzerland, and even then, coverage was limited to a small number of European countries with early television infrastructure. By the 1966 tournament in England, television had transformed the competition's reach significantly. The match could be watched by millions of people who could not afford to travel to England or who lived on the wrong side of the world. By 1970 in Mexico, the tournament was being broadcast in color to hundreds of millions of viewers. By 2022, an estimated 5 billion people across 211 countries watched some part of the Qatar World Cup, approximately 62% of the entire human population of the Earth. That number is extraordinary. No other single cultural event reaches anything close to 5 billion people. The Olympic Games come closest, but even they do not match the concentrated, shared attention that the World Cup generates. The tournament creates, for a period of roughly a month every 4 years, something that functions as a global shared experience. A story that almost everyone on Earth is following simultaneously, across every language and culture and time zone. The final between Argentina and France in 2022 was watched by more than 1.5 billion people at the same time, which means that approximately 1 in 5 human beings on the planet was watching the same sporting event in the same moments. The global television rights that produce this reach are also, of course, one of the primary sources of FIFA's enormous revenue, and the competition between broadcast networks for those rights has driven prices to levels that raise genuine questions about whether football's governing bodies have allowed commercial considerations to override sporting ones. The scheduling of matches at times convenient for European television, which has historically been the most commercially valuable market. At the expense of the health of players competing in conditions unsuitable for those times is one example of this tension playing out in practice. The commentary traditions that different countries bring to World Cup coverage are themselves worth a moment's attention because they reveal something about how different cultures relate to the sport. The famous goal call, extending the word for goal into a prolonged, almost musical vocalization that can last for 30 or 40 seconds, comes from Latin American radio and television commentary and has spread to broadcasters in many other countries as a borrowed expression of collective joy. British commentary has traditionally been more restrained and descriptive, prioritizing information over emotional expression. African broadcasters bring their own cultural traditions of call and response and community expression. The way a goal is described tells you something about the relationship between a community and the game. The music associated with the World Cup deserves its own brief chapter because it has produced some genuinely remarkable cultural moments alongside some that are best forgotten. The official FIFA World Cup songs have ranged from the genuinely beloved. Shakira's Waka Waka for the 2010 South Africa tournament became one of the best-selling World Cup songs in history and introduced much of the world to a specific type of infectious West African-influenced pop music, to the less fondly remembered. The Vuvuzela, which we mentioned earlier in the context of South Africa 2010, was not strictly speaking music, but was certainly sound, and its polarizing effect on audiences was one of the most discussed non-football topics of that tournament. Nessun Dorma, the Puccini aria used by the BBC to introduce their 1990 World Cup coverage, created a cultural moment that linked classical music to a mass football audience in a way that surprised everyone involved and demonstrated that the World Cup audience was capable of responding to aesthetic experiences well outside their expected comfort zone. The theme became so associated with the tournament that it still evokes the 1990 World Cup for millions of people who hear it today, decades later. The merchandise and commercial apparatus that surrounds the modern World Cup is a world unto itself. Official mascots have been a feature of the tournament since Willie, the cartoonish lion who served as the mascot for the 1966 England tournament. Mascots have since included Naranjito, the orange for Spain 1982, Chow the stick figure for Italy 1990, Striker the dog for USA 1994, Footix the rooster for France 1998, Otto the elephant for Korea-Japan 2002, Golio the lion for Germany 2006, Zakumi the leopard for South Africa 2010, Fuleco the armadillo for Brazil 2014, Zabavaka the wolf for Russia 2018, Laib the disembodied keffiyeh-like figure for Qatar 2022, and the characters created for the 2026 North America tournament. The quality of these mascot designs has been debated with the kind of earnest intensity that only football supporters can bring to something as objectively unimportant as a cartoon animal associated with a sporting event. Official match balls have been a source of controversy far beyond what you would expect from what is ultimately a roughly spherical object inflated with air. The Jabulani ball used at the 2010 South Africa World Cup was criticized by goalkeepers worldwide for its unpredictable flight path. It moved through the air in ways that appeared to violate the intuitions that goalkeepers had built up over years of experience with more conventional balls. Several goals at the 2010 tournament were attributed at least partly to the ball's unusual behavior. Goalkeepers complained publicly and at length. The food and culture of host nations has always been part of the World Cup experience for traveling supporters. The distinctive character of each host city, the food markets of Belo Horizonte, the rooftop bars of Berlin, the night markets of Seoul, the ancient souks of Doha, becomes part of the texture of each tournament for the people who travel there. The World Cup functions as a kind of temporary global village, gathering people from every corner of the world into a shared space and shared experience. And the host nation effect. the measurable statistical tendency for teams playing on home soil to perform better than their ranking would predict, is one of the most discussed phenomena in World Cup analysis. Every host nation since the tournament began has advanced beyond the group stage. 8 of the 21 tournaments played before 2022 were won by the host nation. The reasons are partly practical. Home teams do not need to travel, sleep in unfamiliar beds, or adjust to different climates, and partly psychological. Playing in front of your own people, hearing your own language in the crowd, seeing familiar faces in the stands, gives players something that is difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Home advantage in sport is real, and at the World Cup, it has been more consistently demonstrable than in almost any other sporting competition. We arrive, at last, at the present moment, and the immediate future. The 2026 FIFA World Cup, co-hosted by the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the first time in history that 3 nations have shared the hosting of a single tournament, is the most ambitious expansion in the competition's 96-year history, and it represents a genuine watershed moment in how the World Cup operates and what it means for the global game. 48 teams, 104 matches, 16 cities across 3 countries. The tournament runs from June 11th to July 19th of 2026, spanning 39 days, a week longer than previous tournaments. The format has been redesigned around 12 groups of 4 teams each, with the top 2 from each group advancing automatically and the 8 best third-place teams joining them in a round of 32. Teams reaching the final must now win 8 matches rather than 7, the longest road to a World Cup title in the tournament's history. The 3 host nations bring different things to the experience. The United States brings NFL stadiums of enormous capacity. Venues like MetLife Stadium in New York and New Jersey, the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, AT&T Stadium in Dallas, and the Levi Stadium in San Francisco, that have the infrastructure and the commercial sophistication to handle events of the scale the World Cup requires. The United States also brings a football culture that has been developing steadily since the 1994 World Cup, nurtured by decades of ML soccer, by the growth of college soccer programs, and by the increasing presence of American players in European leagues. The American national team is now a competitive force in CONCACAF and has qualified for the tournament as a host nation with genuine ambitions of making a deep run. Canada brings 2 cities, Toronto and Vancouver, and a national football story that has been transforming with remarkable speed in recent years. The Canadian men's national team qualified for the 2022 World Cup for the first time since 1986, ending a 36-year absence, and arrived in Qatar as a competitive force with players of genuine quality, including Alphonso Davies, a left back of extraordinary pace and technical ability who grew up as a refugee from Liberia and Ghana and came to Canada as a child, eventually becoming one of the best players in the world at his position. Mexico brings 3 cities. Mexico City's Estadio Azteca, Guadalajara's Estadio Akron, and Monterrey's Estadio BBVA, and a football tradition that is among the richest in the Americas. The Azteca, which has hosted 2 World Cup finals, in 1970 and 1986, and which holds the memories of Pelé's Brazil and Maradona's greatest moments, is one of the most historically significant football venues on earth. Playing a match there carries a weight of history that players feel regardless of what anyone tells them to feel or not feel. The expansion to 48 teams has brought nations to the World Cup stage that have never been there before. Curaçao, Jordan, and Uzbekistan are among the teams making their World Cup debut in 2026. The Democratic Republic of the Congo and Haiti are returning after decades of absence. The broader representation of Africa, Asia, and the Americas that the expanded format makes possible is one of the most genuinely exciting aspects of what the 2026 tournament promises. Critics of the expansion point to concerns about quality. When you move from 32 to 48 teams, you necessarily include nations that would not have qualified under the more restrictive format, And the argument goes that group stage matches between strong nations and significantly weaker opponents reduce the overall quality of football on display. FIFA's response has been that the benefits of global inclusion outweigh the costs of occasional quality gaps in the group stage, and that the history of World Cup upsets, North Korea beating Italy, Senegal beating France, Saudi Arabia beating Argentina, suggests that the gap between supposed minnows and established powers is regularly overstated. The United States hosting is particularly significant in the long view of football's development. The country has roughly 330 million people and an economy of enormous scale, and the degree to which football has grown there since 1994 is considerable. MLS has expanded from 10 clubs in 1996 to 30 clubs by the mid-2020s. Attendance has grown steadily, and the presence of American players in the top European leagues has increased dramatically. Whether the 2026 World Cup accelerates this growth into something that makes the United States a genuine football power in the coming decades is one of the most interesting questions in the game's future. The 2030 World Cup, the centenary tournament, marking 100 years since Jules Rimet's first competition in Uruguay, is planned to be held across 6 countries on 3 continents, with centenary matches to be played in Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay as a tribute to the tournament's South American origins, alongside the main hosting responsibility being shared by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. It will be the most geographically dispersed tournament in history, a genuine attempt to make the centenary celebration feel truly global rather than rooted in any single region. The 2034 World Cup has been awarded to Saudi Arabia, a decision that generated controversy similar in nature, if not quite in scale, to the controversy surrounding the 2022 Qatar Award. Saudi Arabia's human rights record, its restrictions on individual freedoms, and the financial power that the Saudi government has been deploying across global sport have all generated significant debate about whether FIFA's decision-making process continues to prioritize sporting and ethical considerations appropriately. The debate is ongoing and will intensify as 2034 approaches. But step back from the immediate political and ethical debates and look at the long arc, from 1930 to the present. And what you see is something genuinely remarkable. A tournament that began with 13 nations playing in a small South American country, with European teams reluctant to make the journey and the whole enterprise regarded by many as an interesting experiment rather than an inevitable institution, has become the most watched sporting event in human history. A competition that gave the world Pelé and Maradona and Messi and Cruyff and Ronaldo and Eusebio and Zidane and Mbappé. A tournament that has been held in every inhabited continent, in countries of every political character, in conditions ranging from the cold of a Swiss winter in 1954 to the blazing noon heat of Mexican summer in 1986 to the air-conditioned stadiums of a Qatari winter in 2022. The World Cup has survived 2 world wars, the Cold War, the FIFA corruption scandal, the controversies of 1978 and 2022, the stolen trophy, the hand of God, the tears of Roberto Baggio in 1994, the headbutt of Zidane in 2006, and the penalty that sailed over the bar and ended an era for the magnificent Magyars. It has survived all of this because what it offers, a genuine competition between nations played at the highest level, with stakes high enough to matter, on a stage big enough for the whole world to watch, is irreplaceable. There's nothing else quite like it. There has never been anything quite like it. The next time you watch the World Cup, whether it is the 2026 tournament beginning in June of that year or a future tournament long after, try to hold in your mind simultaneously the full weight of what you are watching. Not just the match in front of you, but the 90 years of history behind it. The Maracanazo. Carlos Alberto's goal in 1970. Maradona's 2 goals in 4 minutes in 1986. Italy falling to North Korea in Middlesbrough in 1966. Iniesta scoring in extra time in Johannesburg in 2010. Messi lifting the trophy in Lusail in December 2022. Every match exists in the context of all the matches that came before it. Every player steps onto the World Cup pitch carrying, whether they know it or not, the weight and the gift of everything that has happened on that stage. The first goal Jules Rimet watched in Montevideo in 1930. Lucien Laurent's volley against Mexico, began a chain of moments that runs unbroken to whatever happens next. The beautiful game, the World Cup. 96 years of the most extraordinary sporting competition humanity has ever produced. And we are not even close to done. If this journey through the World Cup's history has kept you company tonight, and if you are now drifting somewhere comfortable and quiet, then this video has done exactly what it set out to do. Leave me a comment below telling me where you are in the world and what time it is, and tell me which moment in World Cup history is the one that stays with you most. I read every single one. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please subscribe to Sleepy ASMR Seduction and leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. The World Cup will be back. It always comes back.